Disclaimer. This book may contain content that is considered historically inaccurate or culturally insensitive by modern standards. My hope is that by exploring old literature, we will better understand why people of the past thought the way that they did and understand the influences that shape their culture. This video is not intended for young audiences. Disclaimer for Midshipmen's Pranks. This story contains cruelty towards and the death of an animal, and if this makes you uncomfortable, I completely understand if you want to skip this story. Hi, I'm Morgan, and today I'm excited to read to you from Out of Door book, which is the 7th book in a series or a collection of books called The Children's Hour, which were published by Houghton Mifflin Co. in 1907, and I will be reading Midshipmen's Pranks by Basil Hall. Fun fact, this video is a reshoot because I was having some audio issues. During the long winters of our slothful discontent at Bermuda, caused by the Peace of Amiens, the grand resource, both of the idle and the busy, amongst all classes of the Leander's officers, was shooting, that never-ending, still-beginning amusement which Englishmen carry to the remotest corners of the habitable globe, popping away in all countries, thinking only of the game, and often but too reckless of the prejudices or the fears of the natives. This propensity is indulged even in those uninhabited regions of the earth, which are visited only once in an age, and if Captain Perry had reached the pole, he would unquestionably have had a shot at the axis of the earth. In the meantime, the officers and the young gentlemen of the flagship at Bermuda, in the beginning of 1803, I suppose to keep their hands in for the war which they saw brewing, and hourly prayed for, were constantly blazing away among the cedar groves and orange plantations of those fairy islands, which appeared more and more beautiful after every such excursion. The midshipmen were generally obliged to content themselves with knocking down the blue and the red birds with the ship's pistols, charged with His Majesty's gunpowder, and, for want of small shot, with slugs formed by cutting up His Majesty's musket bullets. The officers aimed at higher game, and were, of course, better provided with guns and ammunition. Several of these gentlemen had brought from England some fine dogs, high-bred pointers, while the middies also, not to be outdone, must needs have a dog of their own. They recked very little of what breed, but some sort of animal they said they must have. I forget how we procured the strange-looking beast whose services we contrived to engage, but having once obtained him, we were not slow in giving him our best affections. It is true he was as ugly as anything could possibly be. His color was a dirty reddish yellow, and while one part of his hair became knotted and twisted into curls, another portion hung down quite straight, almost to the ground. He proved utterly useless for all the purposes of real sport, but was quite good enough to furnish the mids with plenty of fun when they went on shore, and chasing pigs, barking at old white-headed, the word, I believe, is a word that was historically used to describe black women, and other amusement suited to the exalted taste and habits of the rising generation of officers. People will differ about the merits of dogs, but we had no doubts as to the great superiority of ours over all the others on board, though the name we gave him certainly implied no such confidence on our part. After a full deliberation, it was decided to call him Shakings. Now it must be explained that Shakings is the name given to small fragments of rope yarns, odds and ends of cordage, bits of oakum, old lanyards, in short, to any kind of refuse arising out of the wear and tear of the ropes. This odd name was perhaps bestowed on our beautiful favorite in consequence of his color not being very dissimilar from that of well-tarred Russian hemp, while the resemblance was daily increased by many a dab of pitch which, in the hot weather, his rough coat imbibed from the seams between the planks of the deck. If old Shakings was no great beauty, he was, at least, the most companionable of dogs, and though he dearly loved the midshipmen, and was dearly beloved by them in return, he had enough of the animal in his composition to take a still higher pleasure in the society of his own kind, so that when the high-bred, showy pointers belonging to the officers returned on board, after each shooting excursion, Mr. Shakings lost no time in applying to his fellow dogs for the news. The Pointers, who liked this sort of familiarity very well, gave poor Shakings all sorts of encouragement. Not so their masters, the officers, who could not bear to see such an abominable cur, as they called our favourite, at once so dirty and so utterly useless, mixing with their sleek and well-kept animals. At first their dislike was confined to such insulting expressions as the above. Then it came to an occasional kick on the stern, or a knock on the nose with the butt end of a fowling piece, and lastly to a sound cut across the rump with the hunting whip. Shakings, who instinctively knew his place, or, at all events, soon learned it, took all this, like a sensible fellow, in good part, while the mids, when out of hearing of the higher powers, uttered curses both loud and deep against the tyranny and oppression exercised towards an animal which, in their fond fancy, was declared to be worthy all the showy dogs in the wardroom put together. They were little prepared, however, for the stroke which soon fell upon them, perhaps in consequence of these very murmurs, for bulkheads have ears as well as walls. To their great horror and indignation, one of the lieutenants, provoked at some liberty which Master Shakings had taken with his newly polished boot, called out one morning, "Man the jolly boat, and land that dirty, ugly beast of a dog belonging to the young gentleman." "Where shall I take him to, sir?" asked the strokesman of the boat. "Oh, anywhere. Pull to the nearest part of the shore, and pitch him out on the rocks. He'll shift for himself, I have no doubt." So off went poor dear Shakings. If a stranger had come into the midshipman's berth at that moment, he might have thought his Majesty's naval service was about to be broken up. All allegiance, discipline, and subordination seemed utterly cancelled by this horrible act. Many were the execrations hurled upwards at the offending nobs, who, we declared, were combining to make our lives miserable. Some of our party voted for writing a letter of remonstrance to the Admiral against this unheard of outrage, and one youth swore deeply that he would leave the service unless justice were obtained. But as he had been known to swear the same thing half a dozen times every week since he joined the ship, no great notice was taken of this pledge. Another declared, upon his word of honor, that such an act was enough to make a man turn Turk and fly his country. At last, by general agreement, it was decided that we should not do a bit of duty, or even stir from our seats, till we obtained redress of our grievances. While we were in the very act of vowing mutiny and disobedience, the hands were turned up to furl sails, upon which the whole party, totally forgetting their magnanimous resolution, scuttled up the ladders, and jumped into their stations with more than usual alacrity, wisely thinking that the moment for actual revolt had not yet arrived. A better scheme than throwing up the service, or writing to the Admiral, or turning Mussulman, was afterwards concocted. The midshipman, who went on shore in the next boat, easily got hold of poor Shakings, who was howling on the steps of the watering place. In order to conceal him, he was stuffed, neck and crop, into the captain's cloak bag, brought safely on board, and restored once more to the bosom of his friends. In spite of all we could do, however, to keep Master Shakings below, he presently found his way to the quarter-deck, to receive the congratulations of the other dogs. There he was soon detected by the higher powers, and very shortly afterwards was trundled over the gangway, and again tossed on the beach. On this occasion he was honoured by the presence of one of his own masters, a middy, sent upon this express duty, who especially desired to land the brute, and not to bring him on board again. Of course, this particular youngster did not bring the dog off, but before night, somehow or other, old Shakings was snoring away in grand course with his more fashionable friends, the Pointers, and dreaming no evil before the cabin door of the very officer whose beautifully polished boots he had brushed by so rudely in the morning, an offence that had led to his banishment. This second return of our dog was too much. The whole posse of us were summoned to the quarter-deck, and in very distinct terms were positively ordered not to bring Shakings on board again. These injunctions having been given, this wretched victim of oppression, as we termed him, once more landed amongst the cedar groves. This time he remained a full week on shore, but how or when he found his way off again, no one ever knew. At least, no one chose to divulge. Never was there anything like the mutual joy felt by Shakings and his 24 masters at this meeting. He careered about the ship, barked and yelled with delight, and, in his raptures, actually leaped with his dirty feet on the milk-white duck trousers of the disgusted officers, who heartily wished him at the bottom of the anchorage. Thus the poor beast unwittingly contributed to accelerate his hapless fate by this ill-timed show of confidence in those who were then plotting his ruin. If he had only kept his paws to himself, and stayed quietly in the dark recesses of the cockpit, wings, cable tiers, and other wild regions, the secrets of which were known only to the inhabitants of our submarine world, all might yet have been well. We had a grand jollification on the night of Shakings' restoration, and his health was in the very act of being drunk with 3 times 3, when the officer of the watch, hearing an uproar below, the sounds of which were conveyed distinctly up the windsail, sent down to pour our lights out, and we were forced to march off, groveling to our hammocks. Next day, to our surprise and horror, old Shakings was not to be seen or heard of. We searched everywhere, interrogated the coxswains of all the boats, and cross-questioned the marines who had been sentries during the night on the forecastle, gangways, and poop, but all in vain. No trace of Shakings could be found. At length the idea began to gain ground among us that the poor beast had been put an end to by some diabolical means, and our ire mounted accordingly. This suspicion seemed the more natural, as the officers said not a word about the matter, nor even asked us what we had done with our dog. While we were in this state of excitement and distraction for our loss, one of the midshipmen, who had some drollery in his composition, gave a new turn to the expression of our thoughts. This gentleman, who was more than twice as old as most of us, say about 30, had won the affections of the whole of our class by the gentleness of his manners and the generous part he always took on our side. He bore amongst us the pet name of Daddy, and certainly he was as a father to those of us who, like myself, were quite adrift in the ship, without anyone to look after them. He was a man of talents and classical education, but he had entered the Navy far too late in life ever to take to it cordially. His habits, indeed, had become so rigid that they could never be made to bend to the mortifying kind of discipline which it appears essential every officer should run through, but which only the young and light-hearted can brook. What this very interesting person's early history might have been, we never could find out, nor could we guess why he entered the Navy, nor conjecture how it came that a man of his powers and accomplishments should have been kept back so long. Indeed, the youngsters never inquired too closely into these matters, being quite content to have the advantage of his protection against the oppression of some of the old. Indeed, the youngsters never inquired too closely into these matters, being quite content to have the advantage of his protection against the oppression of some of the other oldsters who occasionally bullied them. In all cases of difficulty, we never failed to cluster round him, to tell our grievances, great and small, with the certainty of always finding in him that great desideratum in calamity, a patient and friendly listener. It will easily be supposed that our kind Daddy took more than usual interest in this affair of Shakings, and that he was applied to by us at every stage of the transaction. He felt, like us, sadly perplexed when the dog was finally missing, and for some days afterwards he could afford us no comfort, nor suggest any mode of revenge which was not too dangerous for his young friends to put in practice. He prudently observed that, as we had no certainty to go upon, it would be foolish to get ourselves into a serious scrape for nothing at all. There can be no harm, however, he at last exclaimed in his dry and slightly sarcastic way, which all who knew him will recollect as well as if they saw him now, drawing his hand slowly across his mouth and chin. There can be no possible harm, my boys, in putting the other dogs in mourning for their dear departed friend Shakings, for, whatever has become of him, he is lost to them as well as to you, and his memory ought to be duly respected by his old masters. This hint was no sooner given than a cry was raised for crepe, and every chest and bag ransacked to procure badges of mourning. Each of the pointers was speedily rigged up with a large bunch of black tied in a handsome bow upon his left leg, just above the knee. The joke took immediately, and even the officers could not help laughing, for though we considered them little better than fiends at that moment of excitement, these gentlemen showed themselves, except in this instance, The best-natured and most indulgent persons I remember to have sailed with. They ordered the crepe, however, to be instantly cut off from the dog's legs, and one of the officers remarked to us seriously that as we had now had our piece of fun out, there were to be no more such tricks. Off we scampered to consult old Daddy what was to be done next, as we had been positively ordered not to meddle any more with the dogs. "Put the pigs in mourning," he said. All our crepe had been expended by this time, but this want was soon supplied by men whose trade it is to discover resources in difficulty. With a generous devotion to the memory of the departed Shakings, one of these juvenile mutineers pulled off his black handkerchief and, tearing it in pieces, gave a portion to each of the circle, and thus applied, away we all started to put into practice this new suggestion of our Director General of Mischief. The row which ensued in the pigsty was prodigious, for in those days hogs were allowed a place on board a man of war, a custom wisely abolished of late years, since nothing can be more out of character with any ship than such nuisances. As these matters of taste and cleanliness were nothing to us, we intermitted not our noisy labor, till every one of the grunters wore his armlet of such crepe as we had been able to muster. Then, watching our opportunity, we opened the door and let out the whole herd of swine on the main deck, just at the moment when a group of the officers was standing on the forepart of the quarter-deck. Of course, the liberated pigs, delighted with their freedom, passed in review under the very noses of our superiors, each with his mourning not displayed, grunting or squealing along, as if it was their express object to attract attention to their domestic sorrow for the loss of Shakings. The officers now became excessively provoked, for they could not help seeing that these proceedings were affording entertainment at their expense to the whole crew. The men, of course, took no part in this touch of insubordination, but they, like the middies, were ready enough in those idle times of the weary peace to catch at any species of distraction, no matter what, to compensate for the loss of their wonted occupation of pommeling their enemies. The matter, therefore, as a point of discipline, necessarily became rather serious, and the whole gang of young culprits being set for on the quarter-deck, we were ranged in a line, each with his toes at the edge of a plank, according to the orthodox fashion of these gregarious scoldings, technically called toe-the-line matches. We were then given to understand that our proceedings were impertinent, and, after the orders we had received, highly offensive. It was with much difficulty that either party could keep their countenances during this official lecture. While it was going on, the sailors were endeavoring, by the direction of the officers, to remove the bits of silk from the legs of the pigs. If, however, it be difficult, as most difficult we found it, to put a hog into mourning, it is a job 10 times more troublesome to take him out again. Such, at least, is the fair inference from these two experiments, the only ones, perhaps, on record, for it cost half the morning to undo what we had effected in less than an hour, to say nothing of the unceasing and outrageous uproar which took place along the decks, especially under the guns, and even under the coppers forward in the galley, where 2 or 3 of the youngest pigs had wedged themselves, apparently resolved to die rather than submit to the degradation of being deprived of their sable badges. All this was very creditable to the memory of poor Shakings, but in the course of the day the real secret of this extraordinary difficulty of taking a pig out of mourning was discovered. 2 of the mids were detected in the very act of tying on a bit of black bunting to the leg of a sow, from which the seamen declared they had already cut off crepe and silk enough to have made her a complete suit of black. On these fresh offences being reported, the whole party of us were ordered to the masthead as a punishment. Some were sent to sit on the topmast, cross-trees, some on the top-gallant yard-arms, and one small gentleman, being perched at the jib-boom end, was very properly balanced abaft by another little culprit at the extremity of the gaff. In this predicament we were hung out to dry for 6 or 8 hours, as old Daddy remarked to us with a grin when we were called down as the night fell. Our persevering friend, being rather provoked at the punishment of his young flock, set seriously to work to discover the real fate of Shakings. It soon occurred to him that if the dog had indeed been made away with, as he shrewdly suspected, the ship's butcher, in all probability, must have had a hand in his murder. Accordingly, he sent for the man in the evening, when the following dialogue took place. "Well, butcher, will you have a glass of grog tonight?" "Thank you, sir, thank you. Here is your honour's health," said the other, after smoothing down his hair and pulling an immense quid of tobacco out of his mouth. Old Daddy observed the peculiar relish with which the rogue took his glass, and mixing another a good deal more potent, placed it before the fellow. He then continued the conversation in these words. I tell you what it is, Mr. Butcher, you are as humane a man as any in the ship, I dare say. But, if required, you know well that you must do your duty, whether it is upon sheep or hogs. Surely, sir. Or upon dogs either? Suddenly asked the Inquisitor. I don't know about that, stammered the butcher, quite taken by surprise and thrown all aback. Well, well, said Daddy, here's another glass for you, a stiff northwester. Come, tell us all about it now. How did you get rid of the dog? Of Shakings, I mean. Why, sir, said the peaching scoundrel, I put him in a bread bag, sir. Well, what then? I tied up the mouth and put him overboard, out of the midshipman lower port, sir. Out of the midship lower deck port, sir. Yes, but he would not sink, said Daddy. Oh, sir, cried the fellow, now entering fully into the merciless spirit of his trade, I put a 420-pound shot into the bag, along with Shakings. Did you? Then, Mr. Butcher, all I can say is, you are as precious a rascal as ever went about unhanged. There, drink your grog, and be off with you. Next morning, when the officers were assembling at breakfast in the wardroom, the door of the captain of Marine's cabin was suddenly opened, and that officer, half-shaved and laughing through a collar of soap-suds, stalked out with a paper in his hand. Here, he exclaimed, is a copy of verses which I found just now in my basin. I can't tell how they got there, nor what they are about, but you shall judge. So he read aloud the 2 following stanzas of Doggerel. When the Northern Confederacy threatened our shores, and roused Albion's lion, reclining to sleep, preservation was taken of all the king's stores, nor so much as a rope yarn was launched in the deep. But now it is peace, other hopes are in view, and all active service as light as a feather, the stores may be, and humanity too, for Shakings and shot are thrown overboard together. I need hardly say in what quarter of the ship this biting morsel of cockpit satire was concocted, nor indeed who wrote it, for there was no one but our good Daddy who was equal to such a flight. About midnight an urchin, who shall be nameless, was thrust out of one of the after ports of the lower deck, from which he clambered up to the marine officer's port, and the sash happening to have been lowered down on the gun, the epigram, copied by another of the youngsters, was pitched into the soldier's basin. The wisest thing would have been for the officers to have said nothing about the matter, and let it blow by, but, as angry people are seldom judicious, they made a formal complaint to the captain, who, to do him justice, was not a little puzzled how to settle the affair. The reputed author, however, was called up, and the captain said to him, Pray, sir, are you the writer of these lines? I am, sir, he replied, after a little consideration. Then all I can say is, remarked the captain, they're clever enough in their way, but take my advice and write no more such verses. So the matter ended. The satirist took the captain's hint in good part, and confined his pen to topics below the surface of the water. In the course of a few months the war broke out, and there was no longer time for such nonsense. And that is the end of Midshipmen's Pranks by Basil Hall. Thank you for listening to this story with me, and I hope you have a great day.